Alright guys, so we got 2 more days to kill, so before we count down the best of the best for the Sega Saturn, why don't we take a look at some other highlights I didn't have time to cover this month. First up on the list are going to be the PlayStation 1 ports. So the Saturn was very difficult to port other games to, mostly due to the dual chip setup. So it was kind of rare for PlayStation games to make their way to the console. It did happen from time to time, but most of the time, there wasn't any reason why you'd want to play them on the Saturn versus the PlayStation. But there usually was some kind of concession made to attract people to the different version of the game. So some examples of PS1 games that made it to the Sega Saturn. You had Resident Evil. I guess you can count Tomb Raider, even though that started on the Sega Saturn. There was Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Mega Man 8, and Rayman, which, according to my guy at Software Seconds, actually is superior to the PS1 version. Outside of some crisper graphics, I can't really say for certain that is a superior version, but, you know, it's still cool to play these games on the Saturn, especially something like Symphony of the Night, which has a completely new area dedicated to it. So, yeah, if you're a fan of the Sega Saturn, but you're also a fan of the PlayStation, it is worth digging into the library of games that are also available on both consoles. Next up on the list is the recommendation from the guy who did my console modification, which is 3 Angry Dwarfs, which is a beat-em-up game about, well, 3 dirty dwarves who go around beating up people with sporting goods. Now that sounds really bizarre, really silly, but it just makes for a really fun game. I had loads of fun trying this game out. I love the art style, I love how gritty and cartoony it is, and it's just got a unique vibe compared to other beat-em-ups at the time. I love it. Another really memorable game is Mr. Bones, which is one of the most bizarre 2D platformers I've ever played, but it's also one of the more interesting ones too. This is probably the most varied 2D platformer I've ever played because it seems like every level you are doing something completely different, and that makes for like a game that feels like it's constantly trying new things, which is rare in the genre. It can be a little silly, but like it's got a quirky sense of humor. I love the macabre art style. Like, it's just another memorable game on the Sega Saturn for sure. And of course, we can't talk about the Capcom Fighters, talk about the Sega Saturn without talking about the Capcom Fighters. And I actually have to amend something I said in one of my previous videos. When I was talking about the Capcom Fighters, I said that Marvel vs. Capcom was released on the Sega Saturn, but it actually never was. I was probably getting it mixed up with Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. But even then, like, it's hard to deny the quality of all the arcade ports that came to the console. So, in addition to X-Men Children of the Atom, you have several games in the Street Fighter Alpha series, the Darkstalker games, Marvel Superheroes, X-Men Children of the Atom, and of course, X-Men and Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. These are some of the best fighting games of all time, and the Saturn is really the only place you can play them with as little compromise as possible, outside of playing the games in their in their native arcade cabinets. So yeah, highly recommended. Here's a weird one for you. So Sakura Wars, this is one of the strangest games I have ever played. It's a combination of turn-based strategy and a dating sim. And like, honestly, I didn't really get into Sakura Wars. I get the appeal of it for a lot of people, but I just found it really bizarre. Like, dating sims in general just make me feel weird. Like, it makes me feel like a lifeless loser. But, like, there's at least more to Sakura Wars than just the dating sim component of it. And the the turn-based strategy of it actually is pretty good. So it is a solid game. It's just not my cup of tea. And speaking of games centered around beautiful Asian women, we have the Saturn version of Dead or Alive, which a lot of people seem to forget is actually a really competent fighter outside of the, obvious fan service that is at play here. I mean, the controls are solid, the movement is good. It's a really fun fighting game, and it's pretty well done on the Saturn too. No real complaints. The Saturn was also the birthplace of the Grandia series, which I didn't have time to really sample for the retrospective, but from what I understand, it's just a really polished JRPG, and considering how many entries in the series there have been, it's something that you don't want to pass up if you got a Saturn to play it on. And then there's Dark Savior, which is another game that juggles a lot of different elements. It's one part puzzle game, one part platformer, one part fighting game. Like, there's a lot going on with this game, and how they make a 3D sort of a 3D game with 2D graphics. Again, that seems like something that you would only see like an indie developer doing, but I mean, look at it. It's pretty damn impressive, isn't it? Yet another underrated game for the console. And of course, there's Kenji Eno's original horror masterpiece for the Sega Saturn, and that's D, which is sort of a precursor to Enemy Zero. And this is basically a point-and-click adventure game that's made using pre-rendered 3D graphics. And while I wouldn't call this the most stimulating game, just the fact that you have to sit down and immerse yourself in this horrifying environment for an hour or two in order to, complete the game, because there's no pausing and there's no saving. So if you're going to play the game, you have to do it in one sitting. And the content can be very unnerving. There's actually a great story of how this game got a T for teen rating as opposed to the M rating that it so clearly deserved. Apparently what happened was Kenji Eno was afraid that if the game was rated M for mature, it wouldn't sell well, so he actually sent a doctored version to the ESRB in order to obtain a teen rating. But when it came time to actually produce the game, he sent the manufacturers the uncut version of the game, which is what went to store shelves. I don't know how he got away with that, but if he did, I'm sure the ESRB changed how they distribute their games. They have to be sent the master copy, and then they must send that to the distributor rather than letting the developers handle that. But yeah, it's a great story, and D is a really fun game to play, especially on Halloween. And of course, the biggest highlight of the console, and one you may see tomorrow, is of course Panzer Dragoon Saga. I feel like I've talked about this game at length already with my Panzer Dragoon video, but super underrated. Everyone who worked on this game knew that it wasn't going to do well, but they still put their damnness forward, and it is still one of the best RPGs of all time, and probably the best game on the Saturn. Which, speaking of which, join me tomorrow, and I'll tell you guys what I think the best games are the Saturn has to offer. I'll catch you tomorrow.